Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Our series is entitled, Welcome, Holy Spirit, Understanding the Book of Acts, Part 1, namely Acts chapters 1 to 12, a verse-by-verse audio commentary, which is part of our larger Understanding the Bible series. And this particular lesson is called Better to Obey God Than Man. And it's based on Acts chapter 5, verses 24 to 29. Now, can I just say from the outset, if you really want to understand the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom, and bear in mind that the fear of the Lord and the wisdom it bestows will give you things like riches, honor, and longevity, then this principle right here helps illustrate the fear of the Lord very well. When you are more willing to please God than man, whether to obey God than man, or better to, shall we call it, live for God than to please people, then you're living in the fear of the Lord. You're doing the right thing and the wise thing. Sure, people may not understand your full-on dedication to the Almighty. They may question you. Even other Christians may do it, or family members who you would think would be so happy that you're serving God and living a righteous life. But remember, at the end of the day, you're not trying to please them, but God Himself. It's like those that work in the church as volunteers or even for pay. Who are you working for? The senior pastor or for the Lord? Sure, you give honor and deference to leadership, but ultimately, who is it that you're working for? Because when you think you're doing it for people, you're living in the fear of people. When you're doing it as unto God, you're living in the fear of God. And it's no disrespect for the humans that hold the office, pastors and elders and all that, no disrespect. It's actually just putting first things first. And God needs to be first if we're going to live in the life-giving, wisdom-inducing fear of the Lord. So our lesson is called Better to Obey God Than Man. It starts out here in Acts 5, verses 24 to 29, with a very bemused high priest, captain of the temple, chief priests, Sanhedrin. They cannot understand how these apostles, who they put in a prison with guards all around, could disappear out of the prison and the doors were still shut. But eventually, someone says, look, those guys you arrested and put in the prison, they are free range now. They are in the temple and they're teaching, doing the very thing you wanted to keep them from doing. But what happens is there is what I call a sensitive arrest, and that the authorities come, the captain of the officers, who are only just doing their job, and they're going to re-arrest the apostles, but they do so without any force because basically they wanted to preclude having a riot. Because if they did it violently, they could be stoned by the people because the apostles in the early church were very popular with the average person. So it had to be done sensitively. And then there's the accusation made. First of all, before the council, which is the Sanhedrin, the same body that Jesus faced and that Stephen would face in Acts chapter 7. So the apostles stood before this group, and basically they're going to be read the riot act. In verse 28 of Acts 5, it says, Did not we straitly command you that ye should not teach in this name? And behold, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. So that's the accusation. We, your religious leadership, told you not to preach or teach in this name. But instead, you've not only continued to do so, you've done so in overdrive, and all of Jerusalem is now filled with your doctrine. Furthermore, you intend to make us guilty for the shedding of this man's blood. You're presenting him as someone righteous and innocent, and we are guilty of the execution and murder of a righteous man. Then what we have is the classic reply. We ought to obey God rather than men. This is how Peter responds, and this is how we should all respond. Now, it can be misused as a holier-than-thou thing, but really the fact is, it is important that we obey God rather than men. Because at the end of the day, it's God who provides for all your needs. at the end of the day, it's God that gives you the rewards. It's at the end of the day that God has the power and the willingness to give you whatever is required. Frankly, if you're going to curry favor with anyone, do it with the God who is all, in all, and cares for all. Our lesson is called Better to Obey God Than Man, found in Acts chapter 5, verses 24 to 29. So let's read this entire passage, Acts 5, verses 24 to 29, and let's listen carefully, friends, because this is the word of the Lord. Now when the high priest and the captain of the temple and the chief priests heard these things, they doubted of them whereunto this would grow. Then came one and told them, saying, Behold, the men whom ye put in prison are standing in the temple, and teaching the people. Then went the captain with the officers, and brought them without violence, for they feared the people, lest they should have been stoned. And when they had brought them, they set them before the council. And the high priest asked him, or them, saying, Did not we straitly command you that ye should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, We ought to obey God rather than men. This is Acts chapter 5, verses 24 to 29. And our lesson is called Better to Obey God Than Men. All right, so let's begin with the beginning here, Acts 5:24. And what we're going to learn is that the high priest, the captain of the temple, the chief priests were in a state of bewilderment. Why? Because they arrested these men, these apostles. They put them in prison, had them not only safely locked up, but well guarded. And yet when they go to bring them out, they're gone, even though the guards are still there and the doors are closed. Now remember what we read. The angel of the Lord opened the doors and brought the apostles out. But what happened to the guards? Why didn't they say anything or do anything? Well, the text doesn't say. They possibly were in great shock, or maybe they were sleeping. All we know is everybody was greatly puzzled and wondered what would come next out of this miraculous event. In fact, remember, everything that happened to the apostles was miraculous, whether it's their escape from the prison or whether it was their ministry with signs and wonders following. So they were once lost, but now they are found. Acts 5, verse 25. Someone finally discovered the whereabouts of the apostles. They came running to the high priest and said that the men who they had put in prison are now teaching the people in the temple area around Solomon's porticos. This is exactly what the priestly establishment did not want. It was their worst nightmare. They're trying to suppress this movement of the early Christians. But the more pressure they put on them, the more miracles that happen and the more growth occurs. That's not how it's supposed to be. And after all, they're claiming to represent God, and yet they're actually fighting the move of God that is within their midst. So, yes, the apostles were lost, but now they were found. At least they knew where they were, and they decided, no, we are going to continue to do what we plan to do. We are all gathered together as a council of the Jewish people. We want to now bring these men to account. So they sent the captain of the officers, and they went to the temple area to get the apostles. Now, they did it this time very calmly. They did not use force because they didn't want to upset the people, and they certainly didn't want to get stoned. And if you've ever been to Jerusalem, that's one thing you will never lack are stones. There's plenty of them all over the city and all over the country. And in fact, all the buildings since the time of the British Mandate in the 1920s, every Jerusalem building by municipal ordinance must be made with Jerusalem stone. That's why there's a beautiful consistency in the architecture, the walls, and the landscape. But as it is, these officers don't want to be stoned. And please note, the apostles were cooperative, even in the face of this unjust harassment. Because, friends, please understand, God's servants are not rebels. We are not rebels. And if you think rebels have a cause and rebels somehow are heroes, just remember that the spirit of rebellion God hates. And I mean, he really hates. He calls it a sin. So we don't want to be sinners. We want to do it right. The apostles were not rebels. They cooperated. And now in Acts 5:27, they stand before the council. And we believe this is the Sanhedrin, the same body that Jesus faced, although it's unclear how much time elapsed between this particular incident in Acts 5 and the arrest and execution of Jesus. It's a similar group that Stephen will face in Acts chapter 7. The apostles stood before this group, and they're going to be questioned severely. In fact, ultimately, the council is full of hatred. And when you're full of hatred, your intentions are murderous. As we're going to read, their whole idea is once they hear from the apostles and they will not like what they're told, they'll want to kill them. But the apostles' time has not yet come, and such a plot will not happen. So here is the accusation. And the accusation is found in Acts 5:28. Let me read that verse again. This is what the council said to the apostles. Did not we straitly command you that ye should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Now that is a pretty comprehensive verse. Let's unpack it. First of all, the high priest himself said that they were told not to teach in, and the uses of the phrase, this name. Apparently, he did not even want to utter the name Yeshua or Jesus. He just calls it a name or this name. It reminds me of the incident of the parable of the Good Samaritan, when Jesus asked the inquisitor, who is my neighbor? And he tells the parable of Good Samaritan that it wasn't the priest or the Levite that helped the man who had fallen among thieves, was robbed, and left half dead. They totally ignored him, even though they were meant to be God's servants, a priest and a Levite, no less. But it was a Samaritan, part of a race that was hated by the Jews, and let me tell you, it was mutual. They hated the Jews in return, but it was a Samaritan that helped the unfortunate man in his time of need. I mean, really helped him. Not only bandaged his wounds, took him to the inn, paid his expenses, and even would pay for more expenses if need be. What does Jesus say? Who was the neighbor to the man who had fallen among the thieves? And the inquisitor said, well, the one who showed him mercy. Now, that's a very kind phrase, isn't it? The one who showed him mercy. But please note, what he didn't say is the Samaritan. Or the Samaritan showed him mercy. In other words, he couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. Now, Jesus did. He said Samaritan, but not the hypocritical religious man that was trying to trip up Jesus with dangerous questions. So the man couldn't say Samaritan, and the high priest couldn't say Jesus. He just says this name. Remember, this name, Acts 4:12, there is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. It's Jesus in English, Yeshua in Hebrew. So instead of obeying us, says the high priest, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine. Then, in an interesting twist, the high priest says that the apostles, Peter and his friends, intend to make the council guilty of shedding of this man's blood. So the more that Jesus is magnified, the more condemned is the council, since they were the ones that rejected him and pushed Pontius Pilate to execute this man. They demanded, in fact, his execution. As you may recall in the Gospels, what did they do? They stirred up the mob to say, crucify him, crucify him. So then we come to Peter's response. He is the spokesman. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Now, if you want to live a victorious, loving, peaceful, joyful life, bearing fruit in every season as you grow in the knowledge of God, then this phrase should be your very own. We ought to obey God rather than men. Now, please, let's understand it in its context. We are given earthly leaders, whether it's our parents, our teachers, our pastors, our employers, political leaders, or so on. We have people over us. and we should be compliant with our leadership. In fact, Romans 13 tells us to obey the higher powers. Now, this is important, but the reason we do that is because we believe that these leaders were established by God. Parents, teachers, pastors, and so on. That they are basically God's representatives, even if they don't personally know God himself. God can use anybody. They don't have to be walking closely with him, saved and filled with the Holy Spirit, to be his vessels. After all, he used Nebuchadnezzar, he used Cyrus the Great of Medo-Persia, he even used Balaam's donkey. So he can use anybody. And we obey in the Spirit that when we are obeying leadership, we're obeying God. However, there's an interesting twist. Whenever the leadership, earthly leadership, human leadership, is telling us to contravene God's clear command, then that's where this verse kicks into place. We need to obey God more than men. When men tell us not to do the will of the Lord, then we need to obey the will of the Lord rather than the demands and commands of people. Now, there is a price to pay for this, and the apostles almost at that time paid the ultimate price. They didn't because God was with them and delivered them, and their time had not yet come. But this is the thing we have to bear in mind, because some people can misuse this verse and basically rebel against authority, saying, oh no, I'm actually obeying God, so I don't have to obey you. Never should that be the case. Can I just say, if you are a believer living with your parents, that your parents are not Christian, please hear me out, because I was in that situation too, though thank God my parents came to faith later in life. I never had to disobey my parents when it came to the things of the Lord, even though they did not share my faith at the time, and in some ways were even uncomfortable with it. Somehow, God used them and gave me the parameters to do what I needed to do. Nowhere did I have to disobey them. Although one time, when I wanted to be water baptized, initially they were a bit unsettled, but then they thought, well, I guess if he believes, he should be water baptized. And they supported me in that, amazingly, even though they initially opposed my faith. So it's something remarkable that people who are put in your life as authority figures by God, they will often, though not always, somehow give you some leeway. And if they do oppose, and that does happen, make the decision, filled with the Holy Spirit, it's better to obey God than men, but do so respectfully. Now remember, that's our lesson title, and our lesson for life is this. The much-needed fear of the Lord is demonstrated when we choose to obey God instead of men.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.